They called him a failure for 16 years. Nobody knew the truth. Not yet. His father's final letter was sealed for a reason. What was inside would destroy everything they believed. 11 years he gave up everything, in silence, while his family called him lazy. The brother who stole everything was about to lose it all, and the one they called a failure was about to reclaim his name. He was never the failure. He was the only one who ever told the truth with his life, not his words.
If you have ever been called a disappointment by the very people who were supposed to love you the most, this story will break your heart and then put it back together stronger than before. Stay until the end, because the final letter in this story changes everything you think you most understand about failure, family, and forgiveness. If this story moves you even a little, please hit like and subscribe before we begin, because it helps this channel keep telling stories like this one. And trust me, this one deserves to be heard all the way through. Ethan Caldwell was 45 years old the day his father died, and he was still, in the eyes of his family, the boy who never amounted to anything. He stood at the back of the funeral home in a jacket that was a size too big, borrowed from a cousin because his own good clothes had been sold 2 winters ago, when the rent was due and the freelance, graphic design jobs had dried up. His hands were rough, his knuckles scarred, from years of odd labor jobs he never spoke about. His eyes were tired in the particular way that comes from carrying something heavy for a very long time without ever being allowed to put it down. Across the room, his older brother Marcus stood in a tailored charcoal suit, shaking hands, accepting condolences, playing the part of the grieving eldest son with the practiced ease of a now who had spent his entire adult life performing for an audience. Marcus ran Caldwell Freight and Logistics now, the company their father Richard had built from a single delivery truck into a regional empire over 4 decades. Marcus had an assistant who answered his calls. He had a lake house. He had, in every visible way, become the man their father always said he wanted his sons to be. Their younger sister Claire stood between them, quiet, her eyes darting nervously from one brother to the other, the way she always had since they were children, as if she were still trying to referee a fight that had never technically ended, only paused. "I'm surprised you came," Marcus said to Ethan, not quietly enough that others couldn't hear. "Didn't think you'd want to show your face." "He's still our father, Marcus. He was disappointed in you until the day he died. You know that, right? He told me himself, a month ago, that he didn't know where he went wrong with you." Marcus adjusted his cufflinks. "But sure, pay your respects." Ethan said nothing. He had learned, over the last 15 years, that arguing with Marcus was like arguing with a locked door. You could pound on it all you wanted. It would never open, and you would only end up with bloody knuckles for your trouble. What none of them knew, not Marcus, not Claire, not even the relatives whispering in the corners about how sad it was that Richard Caldwell's youngest son had turned into such a waste of potential, was the real reason Ethan had disappeared from the family business 16 years earlier. It wasn't laziness. It wasn't failure. It wasn't, as Marcus loved to tell anyone who would listen, that Ethan simply didn't have what it took. It was their mother, Eleanor. 16 years ago, when Eleanor Caldwell was diagnosed with early-onset dementia, someone had to be with her every single day, because Richard was building the company's biggest expansion in company history, and Marcus was already climbing the ladder inside it, too busy, too important, too unwilling to slow down his own rising star. Ethan was 29, working as a junior operations manager at his father's company, being groomed, quietly, for a future leadership role. And Ethan had made a choice that no one else in the family was willing to make. He walked away from the company. He moved into his mother's house. He learned how to cook the 3 meals she could still remember eating as a child, how to talk her down from the confusion and fear that came in waves as her mind slipped further away, how to sit beside her at 3 in the morning when she forgot who he was and cried for a husband who was 2 rooms away, working late, unaware, or perhaps unwilling to notice. Richard had asked Ethan to do this quietly. "Don't tell your brother," he'd said. "Marcus is building something. I don't want this to distract him. And don't tell the extended family either, Ethan. They gossip. And I don't want people pitying your mother. Do you understand? Let people think what they think. It will pass. It never passed. For 11 years, until Eleanor's death, Ethan was his mother's full-time caregiver, and the family narrative solidified around him like concrete. Ethan, the son who couldn't hold a real job, who drifted from one failed venture to another, who never lived up to his father's name. Richard let the story stand. Whether out of shame or grief or simple cowardice, he let his youngest son absorb 16 years of contempt rather than correct a single word of it. There were mornings during those 11 years that Ethan never told anyone about, not even Priya, not fully. Mornings when Eleanor woke up, convinced it was still 1994, and asked him, with real terror in her voice, where her little boys were, because she couldn't find them in the house, and she was afraid they'd wandered off near the road. He learned to answer gently, every single time, as though it were the first time she had asked, even on the days she asked 11 times before breakfast. He learned to bathe her with the door cracked open so she never felt trapped, to hide the stove, knobs. After the second time, she nearly started a fire trying to make dinner for a family that, in her mind, was still small and needed feeding. He learned to sit outside her bedroom door on the nights she screamed for a husband who was, in fact, 2 miles away at the office reviewing quarterly freight contracts, because Richard had told him once, flatly, that seeing her like that was more than I can carry along with everything else. He missed birthdays. He missed a cousin's wedding. He missed, almost entirely, his own 20s and the better part of his 30s, the years everyone else spent building careers and falling in love and making the kind of mistakes you're supposed to be allowed to make when you're young. He built none of that. He built, instead, a small, invisible fortress of patience around a woman slowly disappearing. And he never once heard his father say the word thank you, because Richard had decided, for reasons Ethan would not understand until years later, that thanking him out loud would mean admitting, out loud, what everyone else in the family was allowed to pretend they didn't know. And Ethan, who loved his mother more than he feared his own reputation, let it happen too. After Eleanor died, Ethan tried to rebuild something of a career. But 5 years is a long time to be out of an industry, and grief is not something you simply set down and pick your old life back up from where you left it. He took jobs that didn't ask too many questions about the gap in his resume. He got engaged once, to a woman named Priya, who loved him fiercely for exactly the reasons his family could never see. But the engagement fell apart under the weight of his family's constant needling, the family dinners where Marcus made pointed jokes, the way Richard's silence always seemed to agree. Priya had asked him once, near the end, why don't you just tell them the truth? Why do you let them believe you're the failure? Because my mother needed someone to protect her dignity, Ethan had said. And now that she's gone, I guess I don't know how to stop. Priya left not long after that. She told him she loved him, but she couldn't watch him disappear into a lie that was eating him. Alive for people who had never once tried to understand him. That was 6 years ago. Since then, Ethan had built a small, quiet life. A 1-bedroom apartment above a hardware store. A freelance design business that paid the bills most months. A neighbor's dog he walked twice a day. A stray cat he fed on the back steps. And almost no contact with his family beyond obligatory holidays that felt more like inspections than celebrations. Now, Richard Caldwell was dead of a sudden heart attack at 73, and Ethan stood in the back of a funeral home being told, once again, that he had never been enough. 3 days after the funeral, a woman named Diane Whitfield called Ethan's phone. She introduced herself as the Caldwell family's estate attorney, a firm and courteous voice that carried a strange weight, as though she were choosing every word with more care than the situation seemed to require. Mr. Caldwell, your father left specific instructions regarding the reading of his will. All 3 of his children are required to be present in my office on Thursday at 10 in the B. INRI. This is not optional. Your father was very clear about that. I'm sure Marcus already knows what's in it, Ethan said. He usually does. Mr. Caldwell, Diane said, and something in her voice made Ethan go still. Your brother does not know what is in this will. No one does. Your father sealed a personal letter to be opened only after the formal reading, and only in the presence of all three of you. I would strongly encourage you to be there. Thursday came. The Whitfield and Associates office was on the 14th floor of a glass building downtown. All clean lines and quiet luxury. The kind of place that made Ethan feel like an intruder the moment he stepped off the elevator. Marcus was already there, in another perfectly tailored suit, scrolling through something on his phone with the bored confidence of a man who believed the next hour was a formality. Claire sat beside him, twisting a tissue in her hands. "Let's get this over with," Marcus said as Ethan sat down. "I have a 2 o'clock. Diane Whitfield entered with a leather folder and sat across from the three of them, her expression unreadable in the practiced way of someone who has delivered difficult news for a living and learned long ago not to let her face give anything away before she was ready. "Before I begin," she said, "I want you to know that your father came to see me 8 months before his death. He was not a man given to sentimentality, from what I observed, but he cried in this office. More than once." Marcus shifted in his seat. "Can we just get to the will?" Diane opened the folder. The bulk of Richard Caldwell's estate, including full controlling ownership of Caldwell Freight and Logistics, valued at approximately $31 million, is left to... She paused and looked up. "His son, Marcus Caldwell." Marcus exhaled, a small, satisfied breath, as though a verdict he had never doubted had simply been confirmed. Claire looked at her lap. Ethan felt nothing surprising, only the familiar, dull ache of a story that had never once bent in his direction. The family home is left jointly to all three children, to be sold and divided equally. A trust of $200,000 is established for Claire Caldwell, separate from the estate, for her continued independence. Diane continued reading, cool and precise, line after line of a will that gave Marcus everything that mattered, and gave Ethan, once again, nothing but the scraps of an afterthought. When she finished, she set the will down and reached into the folder for a second item. A plain white envelope, sealed with wax, Richard's handwriting across the front reading, simply, to be read aloud to all three of my children together, and only together. "This is the letter I mentioned," Diane said. "Your father asked that I read it exactly as written, in this room, with all of you present. He was insistent that none of you leave before it was finished." Marcus checked his watch. "Is this necessary?" "He asked me to tell you," Diane said, looking directly at Marcus for the first time with something colder in her eyes, "that if any of you tried to leave before this letter was finished, I was to inform you that you would be walking away from the only chance you would ever have to understand the truth about this family." His words, not mine. That got Marcus's attention. He sat back down. Diane broke the seal and began to read. "My children, if you are hearing this, it means I am gone, and it means I finally have to tell you the truth. I was too much of a coward to tell you while I was alive. I have spent 8 months writing and rewriting this letter because I did not know how to say it without breaking something that maybe should have broken a long time ago. Marcus, I am leaving you the company, but I need you to understand why, and I need you to understand that it is not the reward you think it is. 3 years ago, my accountant discovered irregularities in the company's logistics contracts. Over the following 2 years, with the help of a private investigator I hired and never told anyone about, I confirmed that nearly $4.2 million had been siphoned out of Caldwell Freight through a shell, vendor account, invoices for equipment maintenance that was never performed, kickback arrangements with 2 regional suppliers, and falsified fuel records. The investigator traced every one of these transactions back to a single set of approvals. Yours, Marcus. I did not confront you immediately. I wanted to understand why. I hired forensic accountants under the cover of a routine audit so you would not suspect. What I found, beyond the money, was worse than theft. I found the pattern of a man who believed he was entitled to take what he wanted because he had convinced himself and everyone around him that he alone deserved this company. I found emails where you discussed, with our head of finance, ways to structure my eventual retirement so that Ethan would be permanently frozen out of any ownership stake, years before Ethan ever stepped away from the business. You were planning his exclusion before your mother was even diagnosed. Some of you in this room are only now learning that your brother left the company to care for your mother full-time at my request, and that I let all of you believe he had simply failed because I was too weak to correct the story and too afraid of what the truth would cost me with the board, with the family name, with my own pride. Ethan, I am sorry. I am so sorry. You gave your mother 11 years that none of the rest of us were brave enough or selfless enough to give her. And I let you carry the weight of being called a failure in exchange for it, because it was easier for me than admitting that I had asked my own son to disappear. I told myself I would fix it. I told myself there would be time. There was never time. There is never enough time. And I hope somewhere, somehow, you can forgive an old man who loved you and still failed you in the exact same breath. Claire, you were never blind. You saw more of this than either of your brothers realized, and you said nothing because you were afraid of losing what little peace you had in this family. I am not angry with you. I understand. I only hope that after this letter, you will finally feel free to speak. Marcus, the company is yours, on paper, as of today. But I have also given Diane a complete, notarized copy of every document the investigator recovered, the shell vendor records, the falsified invoices, the emails, all of it, along with a signed statement from me detailing what I found and when. Diane has been instructed that if you do not, within 30 days of this reading, voluntarily disclose the embezzlement to the board, return the misappropriated funds in full, and establish a genuine, binding ownership transition that gives Ethan an equal partnership stake in this company going forward, she is legally authorized and directed to submit that entire file to the board of directors and to law enforcement. This is not a threat, Marcus. It is the only lesson I have left to teach you, and I am sorry it could not come from me while I was alive to see whether you would learn it. I built this company with my own hands out of the fear that my children would never have to struggle the way I did. Somewhere along the way, I taught you all the wrong lesson. I taught you that winning mattered more than the truth. I am asking you, all three of you, together, in this room, to finally choose differently than I did. I love you, all of you. I am sorry it took my death to say what I should have said every single day I was alive. Your father, Richard. The room was silent for a long moment after Diane finished reading. Claire was crying openly now, her hand pressed over her mouth. Marcus's face had drained of all its practiced composure, replaced by something raw and frightened that Ethan had genuinely never seen on his brother before. This is insane, Marcus finally said, his voice cracking. He can't. This isn't. You can't just. I have the documentation, Mr. Caldwell, Diane said quietly. All of it. Your father was very thorough. He wanted to give you a real choice, which is more than I would have offered you, frankly, if it had been up to me. Ethan sat very still, his mind struggling to catch up with 16 years of carefully constructed grief suddenly cracking open into something entirely different. Not just sorrow, but a strange, disorienting vindication that felt nothing like the relief he might once have imagined. He had spent so long being told what he was, that hearing, finally, what he had actually done, felt like standing in sunlight after years underground. His eyes stung. He did not look at Marcus. He looked at Claire, who reached across the space between their chairs and took his hand. The first time she had done that since they were children. I always knew you didn't just disappear, Claire whispered. I just never had the courage to ask why. Marcus did not speak to either of them for the rest of that meeting. He left first, practically running for the elevator, his phone already pressed to his ear, presumably calling a lawyer of his own, or perhaps calling the finance director he had conspired with, to figure out how deep the hole truly went. The 30 days that followed were the strangest of Ethan's life. At first, Marcus tried to fight it, hiring an attorney to challenge the will, to argue that their father had been of unsound mind, that the letter was some kind of manipulation orchestrated by a bitter old man in his final months. But Diane Whitfield had done her work well, and the documentation Richard had assembled was airtight. Bank records, forensic audit trails, time-stamped emails that Marcus had never imagined anyone would ever read. 2 weeks in, Marcus's own attorney advised him, in no uncertain terms, that fighting this in court would not only fail, it would guarantee criminal exposure that a quiet settlement could still avoid. On day 26, Marcus called Ethan for the first time in years without a single insult in his voice. "I don't know how to do this," he admitted, and for once, he sounded like exactly what he was, a courtin' man who had spent his whole life building a version of himself that could not survive contact with the truth. "I don't know how to face the board. I don't know how to face you." "You start," Ethan said, "by telling the truth. All of it, not the version that protects you, the real one." It was not a fairy tale reconciliation. Marcus did not become a different man overnight, and some wounds between them never fully closed. 16 years of contempt does not dissolve because of one letter, however honest. The board meeting where Marcus disclosed everything was one of the hardest 90 minutes of Ethan's life, not because he pitied his brother, exactly, but because watching Marcus's voice shake as he read a prepared statement, admitting to shell accounts and falsified invoices in front of 11 people who had trusted him for a decade, was the first time Ethan had ever seen his brother look genuinely small. 2 board members resigned in protest. One called for immediate termination and a criminal referral on the spot. It was Ethan, of all people, who spoke next, calmly laying out the restitution plan Diane had helped structure and asking the board to consider that a full, voluntary confession made before any outside party forced the issue was worth something, even if it did not erase the harm underneath it. "You're defending him," one board member said afterward, incredulous. "After everything he did to you." "I'm not defending what he did," Ethan said. "I'm just done deciding people's worth the way he decided mine." Marcus repaid what he could of the misappropriated funds through a structured settlement with the board, avoided criminal charges by the narrowest of margins through full cooperation and restitution, and stepped down from day-to-day operations, remaining a shareholder but no longer the man in charge. He moved out of the lake house within the year, quietly, without the dramatic collapse some of the more distant relatives seemed almost eager to witness. He started seeing a therapist, something he had mocked Priya for doing years earlier at a family dinner Ethan still remembered with a wince. He and Ethan were not close, not the way brothers in easier families might be, but they began, slowly, showing up to the same holidays without the old, practiced cruelty, and for 2 men who had spent 16 years as strangers, wearing the same last name, that was its own kind of miracle. Ethan, to almost everyone's surprise, including his own, did not want revenge nearly as much as he wanted to finally be seen. He did not gut the company or humiliate his brother publicly, though he could have. Instead, he took the operations role their father had once been quietly grooming him for, 16 years late, and he ran it with the same patience he had once used to calm his mother's confused, frightened nights. Steady, present, unwilling to abandon something just because it had become difficult. At the next family gathering, an aunt who had spent years quietly pitying Ethan at every holiday, dinner cornered him by the dessert table, her voice lowered as though she were confessing something. "I owe you an apology," she said. "We all talked about you like you'd wasted your life. Your father let us believe that. I'm sorry I never once asked you why." Ethan accepted the apology the way he had learned to accept most things that year, without bitterness, but also without pretending it undid 16 years of dinner table comments he had absorbed silently, one holiday at a time. He told her simply that the next time someone in the family looked like they were struggling, it might be worth asking why before deciding what their struggle meant. She nodded, and for the first time in years, actually seemed to hear him. Claire, freed by the truth finally being spoken aloud, left her quiet administrative job within the year and went back to school for social work, something she said she had wanted to do since she was 19, but had never believed she was allowed to want. She and Ethan grew close in a way they never had been as children, meeting for dinner every other week, filling in for each other the years of family they had both quietly lost. A year after the reading of the will, Ethan stood in the same office building, this time not as a grieving son being told he had failed, but as a managing partner reviewing a new community fund the company had established in Richard Caldwell's name, one that quietly, anonymously, paid for in-home caregivers for families who could not otherwise afford them. No one but Diane Whitfield and Claire knew that Ethan had insisted on that particular clause. He did not need anyone to know. He had spent 16 years being invisible for reasons that were finally fully understood, and he found, to his own surprise, that he no longer needed applause to know the truth of what he had done. Priya reached out to him 9 months after the funeral, having heard through a mutual friend some fragments of what had happened. They met for coffee, cautiously, two people who had once loved each other honestly in a family that had made honesty feel dangerous. It did not fix everything instantly between them either, but it was a beginning, the kind Ethan had once believed he no longer deserved. Sometimes, late at night, Ethan still thought about his father's letter, about the particular cruelty and cowardice of a man who loved his children and still let one of them drown in a lie for 16 years rather than face an uncomfortable truth. He forgave him eventually, not because his father deserved easy forgiveness, but because Ethan understood, finally, what it costs a person to carry silence for that long, and he did not want to spend the rest of his life carrying that same weight himself. What he learned, in the end, was this: the people who call you a failure are very often only describing the shape of the sacrifice you made for them, one they never had the courage or the character to make themselves. The truth does not always arrive in time to prevent the damage, but it can still arrive in time to begin the repair, if you are brave enough to let it. Ethan Caldwell was no longer the family failure. He never had been. He had simply been the only one willing to lose everything for the people who never once thought to ask what he had given up. If this story reminded you of your own family, your own silence, or your own version of a truth you're still waiting for someone to finally speak out loud, let us know in the comments below. And if you believe stories like this deserve to be told, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel, because there are so many more stories just like Ethan's still waiting to be shared.